3. Operation Tidal Wave. On August 1, 1943, 178 B-24 Liberator bombers took off from the US Army Air Force's base in Benghazi, Libya, for the Romanian city of Ploiesti, 1,200 miles away. Dubbed Operation Tidal Wave, the mission's objective was to destroy a massive oil refinery complex, which was providing as much as 60% of the Axis fuel. It was planned by a man named Colonel Jacob Smart, who came up with the idea of dropping bombs on the plant from 200 to 800 feet in the air. Until then, the B-24 bomber had only been used for high-altitude precision bombing, because that's what it was designed for. Smart believed that the plan would take the Germans by complete surprise. To avoid tipping them off about the mission, the pilots maintained radio silence throughout their entire flight from Libya to Romania. Little did they know, the Nazis already knew they were coming. The region's Luftwaffe commander, Colonel Alfred Gerstenberg, had deciphered the American code that was used in Allied correspondence about the upcoming attack. He prepared for their arrival by encircling the city with several hundred anti-aircraft guns and protecting ground targets with barrage balloons attached to steel cables, which had the potential to do deadly damage to any B-24s that flew into them. The planes were traveling in 5 groups. According to Smart's plan, it was strategically crucial for them to all arrive at Ploiesti at the same time. But 2 of the groups used high power settings and unknowingly pulled ahead of the other formations. Because they were ordered to maintain radio silence, they couldn't communicate with each other to get back in sync. Another group followed the wrong visual cue along their route and mistakenly turned in the wrong direction, at which point some of the men broke radio silence due to the severity of the error. When the airmen began dropping bombs over the refinery's oil tanks, the flames from the ensuing explosions were higher than their planes. Ben Kiyoroki, who served as a gunner in the mission, told museum historian Tom Gibbs that he felt sure they were doomed and thought it was a miracle when their aircraft didn't catch on fire. Mac Gerald, who was flying in another Liberator, recalled seeing smoke all around them. Like Kiyoroki, he thought he was going to die and was shocked when he didn't. After shooting his plane down, the Germans captured him and his crew. The attack only lasted for about 30 minutes, but the losses were major, earning the costly operation the nickname of Bloody Sunday. 52 aircraft were shot down. Out of the 1,751 airmen who participated in the mission, 310 died, 130 were wounded, and more than 100 were taken prisoner. Between those who died, went missing, or were taken captive, roughly 30% of the men who set out for the mission didn't return. The Germans put forced laborers to work rebuilding the damaged refinery complex. Just weeks later, its oil productivity was even better than it had been before the attack. More than 8 months went by before the Allies once again considered an attack on Romania's oil industry. The disastrous mission serves as a reminder of Romania's major but often overlooked role in World War II. Led by a military dictator named Ion Antonescu, the country formally joined the Axis powers in November 1940. Antonescu was a loyal and reliable ally to the Nazis. Between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews were murdered under his regime, more than any other country except Nazi Germany. Before we continue with the other World War II missions that went wrong, remember to subscribe to American Eye for more videos like these. 2. Avenger Accidents. The Grumman TBF Avenger was the most effective and widely used torpedo bomber of World War II. It was developed during the early 1940s for service in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. It experienced many successes, including the sinking of the Japanese super battleships Yamato and Musashi, as well as 30 submarines. But the aircraft has also run into its fair share of trouble. When it first saw combat in 1942 during the Battle of the Midway in the South Pacific, 5 of the 6 Avengers involved in the fighting were lost. And while this didn't necessarily reflect the quality or effectiveness of the aircraft, it's hard not to wonder if anyone questioned the plane's abilities after the battle. This photo reportedly shows an Avenger next to the light aircraft carrier USS Bataan, after a catapulting mishap on board and engine failure forced the pilot to ditch it in the water on March 13, 1944. If these details are correct, then it means that the incident happened while the Bataan was en route from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The following year, a group of 5 Avengers mysteriously vanished during a routine naval training exercise off Florida. Led by experienced pilot and combat veteran Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, 14 airmen took off from Fort Lauderdale on December 5, 1945. They were supposed to follow a triangular flight plan that involved flying south over a place called Hens and Chicken Shoal, then heading north over the Bahamas and southwest back to base. The flight initially went as planned, but things took a bizarre turn after the pilots turned left to fly north for the second leg of their trip. For some reason, Lieutenant Taylor became convinced that his navigation equipment was malfunctioning and that they were flying in the wrong direction. To make things even worse, the group soon encountered heavy gusts and rain, which most likely made them even more disoriented. Taylor radioed the Naval Air Station and claimed that his compasses were out. He said that he thought his group was several hundred miles off course over the Florida Keys. But they weren't actually flying above the Gulf of Mexico like Taylor thought. They were out over the Caribbean Sea where they were supposed to be. The other pilots knew that something wasn't right. But there was no convincing him that his thinking was wrong, and the personnel back at base were unable to provide the Avengers' coordinates. Taylor ordered his fellow airmen to fly northeast, taking them further out to sea. He only became more disoriented from there, despite having received directions on how to navigate his plane toward Fort Lauderdale using visual cues. Later on, some officials would question why the trainees continued to listen to their clearly confused superior. The most likely explanation is that disobeying a superior is heavily frowned upon in the military, and in many cases it's punishable. At one point, the trainees convinced Taylor to go west, but he decided shortly thereafter that they hadn't traveled quite far enough east, and once again ordered everyone to fly in the wrong direction. Radio transmissions grew weak as the Avengers ran out of fuel. Taylor instructed his pilots to prepare to ditch. Taylor was last heard saying that they would have to ditch before communication stopped. A Navy search team immediately sprang into action and searched for the confused crew by boat. Not only have the downed aircraft never been found, the search team also vanished and was never seen again. It's likely that the wrecked planes are sitting at the bottom of the sea somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle, but their fate and Taylor's strange behavior that led up to it remain a mystery. World War II had officially ended just 3 months earlier, and the world was still very much entangled in its aftermath. But there's no reason to think that the pilots met with foul play, and most experts agree that they would have made it back to base if they'd just flown west when they were instructed to do otherwise. 1. Convoy catastrophe. Throughout World War II, both the American and British militaries relied almost entirely on civilian merchant mariners to transport much-needed supplies to their destinations. These hundreds of thousands of brave volunteers received little recognition at the time, but they're now often thought of as the war's unsung heroes. They routinely put their lives on the line and experienced a much higher casualty rate than most other war-related jobs, despite not being in the military. Merchant vessels traveled in large, slow convoys. They were major targets for German U-boats. At first, convoys traveled unescorted or with little protection from just a few vessels that were equipped for anti-submarine warfare. The losses became so problematic that at one point, attacks on convoys threatened the entire war effort in Britain. In October of 1940, the consequences of the decision to provide merchant ships with inadequate protection became alarmingly clear. A convoy known as SC-7, consisting of 35 British merchant ships, left Newfoundland, Canada for Liverpool, England, with just a single sloop as an escort. To the frustration of the captains of faster ships, it puttered across the Atlantic at speeds as slow as 8 knots. The ships eventually became scattered. By the time the convoy's first vessels approached Ireland, more escorts had become available, but the ships had become so spread out that there was no realistic way to defend them all. 20 were sunk by U-boats, resulting in the deaths of crew members and the loss of 80,000 tons of cargo. The US eventually stepped in and helped protect merchant convoys by providing additional naval escort vessels. These protections were in place by the time the Allies began sending supplies to the Soviet Union in August 1941. The first few convoys to Russia were met with little resistance from the Germans. But traveling as a merchant mariner was still a tremendously dangerous job, especially as the Nazis dramatically increased their attacks against convoys. Merchants and sailors also faced the dangers of the unforgiving Arctic route, which was the fastest but most dangerous way to get supplies to the Soviet Union. One especially disastrous incident happened during the 17th convoy to the Soviet Union, known as PQ-17. Consisting of 34 merchant mariner vessels, an oiler, and 3 rescue ships, it set out from Iceland for the port of Arkhangelsk on June 27, 1942. It was the most expensive convoy to set sail so far throughout the war, carrying more than $500 million worth of military supplies. The convoy's well-armed British and American escort included 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and 2 submarines. As soon as the ships were out on the open sea, a U-boat began trailing them. Even without the threat of an enemy force, sailing on a merchant vessel was fraught with hazards. In addition to facing brutal temperatures and often heavy seas, it was summertime in the Arctic, which meant 24/7 daylight and no protection from the cover of night. On any given clear day, the ships were in plain view of any German planes that might fly overhead. 5 days into the voyage, the Germans began attacking the vessels from both the water and the air. The attack steadily increased for 2 days, and 2 ships were sunk before the escort learned that another German battleship was on its way to intercept the convoy. The merchant ships were ordered to scatter while the escort moved further west. This was meant to make it harder for the Germans to sink the ships, but it had the exact opposite effect. It left the convoy more vulnerable to attack and without an escort for protection. The following day, on July 5th, the Nazis sunk 12 merchant vessels, and the carnage continued from there. Naval Armed Guard Seaman Donald Ross Nagatz was assigned with manning weapons on merchant vessels and was working on a ship called the Pan-Atlantic. On July 6th, the Germans bombed the ship, causing it to sink in just 3 minutes and leaving Nagatz at the mercy of the icy Arctic Sea. He found a raft with a dead body in it, threw the corpse into the water to make room for himself, and drifted for the next day until he was rescued. By the time he reached safety, his hands and feet were so swollen that his boots had to be cut off. The attacks continued for 5 days. When all was said and done, only 11 of the convoy's 34 merchant vessels reached their destination. In addition to the nearly 100,000 tons of cargo that were lost, including food and ammunition, the convoy lost 3,350 vehicles, 210 aircraft, and 430 tanks. Around 150 sailors and officers died. Sadly, it was later learned that the reports of a German battleship coming to intercept the vessels were false. The following convoy, PQ-18, also sustained heavy losses, and Soviet convoys were suspended for several months. We tend to remember World War II's most major combat events like D-Day and the attack on Pearl Harbor, and with good reason. But in doing so, convoy battles are often forgotten for their importance. The Allied war effort relied on these supply shipments. Without merchant mariner convoys and the military escorts who defended them, the war would have essentially been a guaranteed loss to the Allies. Getting shipments to the beleaguered Soviet Union became especially important after the Germans invaded Russia in 1941 in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. Altogether, 78 of these dangerous Arctic convoys were carried out, demonstrating the Allies' commitment to helping the Soviet Union. PQ-17 suffered the worst losses of any convoy throughout the war, including non-Arctic expeditions. When these shipments resumed after the losses sustained by convoy PQ-18, they were much better defended, but protecting merchant mariner vessels from the Germans remained a constant challenge. Thanks for watching. Which one of these mission failures shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.